Okay, so we will be talking about the question muscles and fascias of the thorax, a little bit about the diaphragm, its structure, passages, function, innervation, and a little bit about diaphragmatic hernias as well. The first topic that we'll talk about is the muscles of the thoracic cage. When you talk about muscles of the thoracic cage, you have five muscles that you'll have to mention. And all of these are innervated by the intercostal nerves T1 to T11. Now you can see in the picture above the green muscles. That is what we're going to talk about the first. The external intercostal muscles. You can see that they originate from the inferior part of the ribs, okay, and they insert into the superior border of the ribs below. So what is the direction of the muscle fibers? They go infero-anteriorly, right? So imagine like when the muscles contract according to the muscle fibers, what would they do? Like what would the function be? It would elevate the ribs, like it lift the ribs up, right? So as a result, thoracic volume would increase. This is the major function of external intercostal muscles, which are the green ones. The second muscle we're going to talk about is the internal intercostal muscles. In the picture, they're yellow in color. They originate from the costal groove. What is the costal groove? It's a part of the rib that's kind of inferior and like inside that contains the Van bundle. We'll talk about the Van bundle later in this video, right? Vein, artery, nerve. But yeah, it's the part where these pass through, right? So in the lateral part of the costal groove of your ribs is where your internal intercostal muscles originate, and they insert into the superior part of the ribs lower. So these also go in the inferior direction. The direction of the muscle fibers here is infero-posteriorly. And when these contract, majorly their function is to decrease thoracic volume, but a little part of these muscles that are attached like in the cartilage part of your ribs, they kind of elevate your ribs. Now, your third muscles that we're going to talk about is the innermost intercostals. They're very similar to the internal intercostal in terms of function, everything like origin insertion. It's just that they originate medial to the origination point of the internal intercostals. And I've also like attached a dissection picture here. You can just go through it. Now, the fourth muscle that we'll talk about is the transversus thoracis. You can see in the picture, the purple muscle is what we're going to talk about. It originates from the posterior part of your sternum, like a little below. So the inferior part and the posterior surface of your sternum, and they insert into the internal surface of your ribs, mainly in the cartilage parts, right? And these muscles are only there like a little bit above, so they insert into ribs 2 to 6, and it can vary from person to person, right? The major function of this muscle is to depress the ribs because you can imagine they're inside, right? So when they contract, what would they do? They'll decrease thoracic volume. So they weakly depress the ribs. The fifth muscle that we are going to talk about is the subcostals. Origination is, again, it's in the lower ribs. It's not like how the transversus thoracis is like a little on the upper part. Subcostals start from the inferior surface of the lower ribs, and they insert into the superior surfaces of the ribs below, like 2 or 3 ribs below, right? And their function is very similar to the internal intercostals. Now we'll talk about the layers of the thoracic wall and the fascias, right? When you talk about layers of anything, you start in terms of order, right? Like in terms from outside to inside. You can see in this picture, the first layer is the skin. Then you have the superficial fascia, thoracic fascia, right? And then you have subcutaneous tissue, right? You can just go through this particular diagram. Then the serratus anterior muscle, right? Because they insert into your ribs. external intercostal, internal intercostal, and the innermost intercostal. Then you have your uh, endothoracic fascia. Endothoracic fascia is the fascia between the parietal pleura and your thoracic cage, like your muscles, right? The innermost intercostal muscles, right? Then after the endothoracic fascia, you have the parietal pleura. Parietal is um, outside, right? And visceral is stuck to the organ. Over here, it's the lung, and the cavity in between has the pleural fluid, right? Now, the clinical significance. Now, as I've already spoken about, the VAN bundle, vein, artery, nerve, right? Intercostal, vein, artery, nerve. It's in the same order, VAN. Okay, they are present in between the innermost and internal intercostal muscles, and they pass through your costal groove. What is the significance of this, like clinical significance of the VAN bundle? Is that when you do lumbar puncture for pneumothorax, what is pneumothorax? When you know there's the pleural fluid, right? So whenever there's what is the need of the pleural fluid? It's to keep surface tension, right? Like in between the two pleuras, right? So whenever there's a puncture or like that leads to the ex- like exiting of the fluid, they lose surface tension. This is this condition is called pneumothorax, right? So what they do is you need to uh, remove the excessive fluid, right? And that's why you do a lung puncture. And what is the significance is that you'll have to do it above the lower rib, right? So that you don't puncture the VAN bundle, which is present in the lower part of the ribs. Now we'll talk about, okay, so this is just like a picture from my old notes. This is not relevant to this particular question, but in case examiner like asks you like follow up about the arteries and veins that supply, it's here. Now we'll talk about the diaphragm. What is the diaphragm? Diaphragm is the big muscle that is majorly involved in your breathing, respiratory activity, right? Like it has to in terms of like increasing and decreasing thoracic volume, right? So what is this? This marks like the border between your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity, right? Where it's a musculotendinous sheath. So there is muscles and there's a tendon, right? Now the attachments, like the diaphragm is all over. So like you have a central attachment, which is the central tendon, like the tough part. And then you have it attached to the periphery. You have your xiphoid process of your sternum. Then you have the arcuate ligaments and the ribs. Together they make the diaphragm, right? We'll talk about the attachments in the diagram in the next slide. So the innervation of the diaphragm is by the phrenic nerve. And the diaphragm, as you can see in this picture, there's a right dome, left dome. The right dome is a little higher than the left dome. And the reason is very simple. It's because the liver is there right under your diaphragm. So it's a little higher than your left dome. Now, this is the major structure of a diaphragm. So again, attachment we've already spoken about, but there's the central tendon, right? The tough part, which is the central attachment of the diaphragm. And then you have the muscles. There's the sternal attachment, xiphoid process, it attaches, right? Costal attachment, where it attaches to the lower ribs. And then there's the lumbar attachment, right? Now, the major things that we talk about in the diaphragm is the passages, right? We'll talk about two major passages, which is the hiatus and foramens, right? There's three hiatus that you need to talk about. The caval hiatus, esophageal hiatus, and the aortic hiatus. They're named after the structure that passes through it, right? So the caval one, it has the inferior vena cava. The one thing that's important here is the level of your openings, right? It's okay for cable, it's T8. For the second one, it's T10. For esophagus, it's T10. And then for your aortic hiatus, it's T12. There's a interesting way of remembering it. It's very simple. T8, 8 letters in vena cava. T10, 10 letters in esophagus. 12 letters in aortic hiatus. Just a small way to remember and you don't forget, but it's T8, T10, T12. So the first one, caval hiatus, you have your inferior vena cava and right phrenic nerve. In the second hiatus, you have your esophagus mainly, and then you have your right and left vagus nerve. Uh, I have even structured it in the diagram. You can see the caval hiatus, right, where the inferior vena cava passes through. Where here is where the esophagus passes through, along with the right and left vagus nerve. And then the third one, aortic hiatus, is where your aorta passes through. And along with the aorta, you have your azygous vein and the thoracic lymphatic duct, right? These are very important for your dissections as well. Yeah. And then we'll talk about foramen. There's two foramens that we talk about here. Foramen of Morgagni, right? It has the superior epigastric artery or branch of the internal thoracic artery. And then you have the abdominal lymphatic ducts that pass through this particular foramen. And then you have the lumbocostal triangle or the foramen of Buchanan, right? And why are these important? We'll talk about it. It's mainly because these are openings and these can cause hernias. Okay. So diaphragmatic hernias are when the abdominal organs, they pass through your openings and they get to the thoracic cavity. This this mainly happens because of like a birth defect of the diaphragm. And the most common one, as I've written here, is the lumbocostal triangle hernias, right? So other structures of the diaphragm, you can see there's a central tendon, and this is one. You can see I've labeled it 1, 2, and 3. These are the attachments that we already spoke about, in the previous slide. You have your median, medial, and then lateral arcuate ligaments. Then you also, another important structure in your diaphragm is the lumbar cruce, the right and the left one. The right one's longer than the left one. You need to know that. And that's it about the diaphragm and this particular question in general. So thank you. And yeah, that's it.